The Dragon Who Dabbled in Crypto, a hard-boiled magic adventure by T.W. Allen, performed by Eric Bra. This book was supported by the following producers: Lori Amaliatrice, Ian Chung, Jason Fleigel, Vincent Jorgensen, and Mike Murphy. Chapter 1. The Digital Treasure Hoard. The hippie and the Swede sat down and turned on their respective microphones. It was time to record their podcast. No one was quite sure what their podcast was about, but that didn't seem to impede their popularity, such as it was. "Should we continue where we left off last time?" asked the Swede. "Before we do that," said the hippie, "I want to talk about Schatzhorde de Drachen." "Schatzhorde de Drachen?" The Swede was puzzled. "A German phrase? Doesn't that translate to Dragon's Treasure Hoard?" "It does," exclaimed the hippie. "It's a new form of cryptocurrency. This one's unique because it's backed by gold." "Isn't that the opposite of what cryptocurrency is supposed to do?" asked the Swede. "I thought cryptocurrency was supposed to be independent of physical commodities. Isn't that contrary to the point of cryptocurrency?" "I like the security of it," replied the hippie. "I want to be able to cash it in for sweet, sweet gold. There's just one problem." The hippie was interrupted by a strange tapping at the window. A tapping all the stranger for them being on the 10th floor. As they looked at the window, a tiny dot appeared and glowed red. The glass began to melt where the dot sat on it, and a hole the size of a small coin emerged by the time the dot disappeared. Then a tiny red worm popped through the hole with surprising velocity. The worm flew through the air and landed on the table in front of them. "What the hell is that?" asked the hippie. "It looks like a fireworm," said the Swede. "Hermetice carunculate." "But that doesn't make any sense. Fireworms are aquatic creatures. They don't fly through the air." "Since when did you become a marine biologist?" The hippie raised an eyebrow. "It's important to have hobbies," replied the Swede. "Let's get this out of the studio." The hippie stood up and reached for the worm. "Don't touch it!" cried the Swede. "The fireworm is poisonous. Those bristles around its edges contain a neurotoxin." The hippie pulled back, just in time for the fireworm to erupt into a ball of fire. "Is that why they call it a fireworm?" asked the hippie, stumbling towards the studio door. "Not until today," replied the Swede. The studio door burst open, striking the hippie in the forehead. The podcast engineer dashed in with a fire extinguisher and applied it to the blaze. The Swede picked up a pencil off the desk and used it to probe through the foam left behind by the extinguisher. What was left of the fireworm slid out of the pile and dropped to the floor. "Is it?" inquired the hippie. "It's just as dead as we would have been were we closer when it ignited," whispered the Swede. Chapter 2. Sunk Costs. "How long has this been going on?" asked the man in the black suit. "This is the first physical incident," replied the head of HR, the other person in the room. "There were threats on social media. The hippie was warned there would be consequences if Schatzhorde de Drachen was mentioned on the podcast. Naturally, the hippie made a point of mentioning it, and the attack happened immediately after the words were spoken, like someone was monitoring them, like it was premeditated." "Monitoring them from 10 stories above the ground?" asked the man in the black suit. "Does that meet your engagement requirements?" The head of HR traded a question for a question. "An undersea dwelling animal melts through a window and bursts into flames. Unless we assume that it's just the ocean that keeps them from catching on fire under normal circumstances, would this be considered unusual? Is this a physics problem?" Mr. Lewis had a business card that read physics consultant, but that was something of an in-joke. Mr. Lewis consulted on things that defied the laws of physics, things that went bump in the night, lingered on after death, and ate men's souls. "It's out of the ordinary." Mr. Lewis shook his head in agreement. "I'll be treating it as an assassination attempt until evidence establishes otherwise. Have they discussed supernatural matters on this podcast in the past? Or perhaps fishing?" "Nobody ever knows what they're going to talk about. I mean, the show theoretically has a theme, but they seldom get around to it. They just sort of ramble on about themselves. That's their brand." "Social media threats and a potentially taboo cryptocurrency." Mr. Lewis frowned. This is likely to require a little research. I'll probably also need to provide security for those two until we have a better handle on the threat vector. Their show has been drowning in red ink from the start, sighed the head of HR. What's one more expense in the name of diverse programming options? We will pay, of course. We can't have people taking shots at our employees. Who said it was people taking the shots? Mr. Lewis struggled to suppress a smirk. Very well. The head of HR similarly failed to suppress an eye roll. We'll provide protection for our talent that actually makes money for us, so we're obligated to extend the courtesy for all staff. And assassination attempts inside our building are a horrible look. Makes it hard to recruit. Please try to make this swift, though. This whole thing is hemorrhaging money before it's even begun. I should probably start by interviewing the hippie, offered Mr. Lewis. See if there are any known enemies I should be aware of. You're in luck. They should be about to resume recording. Resume? Mr. Lewis abruptly stood up. Does that mean they'll pick up where they left off? Talking about the same thing they were when they were attacked? Chapter 3. Cocky Conversation. Whatever are you wearing? Asked the Swede. The Swede and the hippie had returned to the recording studio. The hole in the window was covered with a patch of duct tape, and a folding table had replaced the one that had been set on fire. But the studio was more or less functional again. It's my new disco shirt, replied the hippie. Listeners, began the Swede, our mutual friend here is wearing a shirt that's covered with, how should I describe it? Large chunks of mirror ball? Disco balls, corrected the hippie. 2 entire large grade A disco balls were used to decorate this shirt. It's great. You were telling me about this treasure hoard of the Dragon, said the Swede, changing the subject as quickly as possible. Schatzhorde Drachen. The words danced off the hippie's tongue. It's the way of the future. Gold-backed cryptocurrency. That still doesn't make any sense to me, said the Swede. Why would you buy a digital coin representing gold instead of just a gold coin? No, interjected the hippie. It's not representing a cache of gold. The market value of the coin is backed by gold, like when the dollar was on the gold standard. That's not what gold standard is. A gold standard is when you base the value of your currency on the price of gold, a benchmark price. What you describe is the opposite of that. I understand that some people liken cryptocurrency to precious metals as a hedge against inflation, but how much gold would need to be accumulated to back it against the type of appreciation promised by cryptocurrency evangelists? They always call for 100 times return, if not 1,000 times. Would not holding that much gold prove impractical, if not impossible? Where do they find it, and where do they store it? I've seen pictures, cried the hippie. They have mountains of gold. Nobody knows where it came from, but they have gold. Okay, sighed the Swede. Let's just assume those pictures are real. I'll play along. What is the catch? That's right. The hippie leaped up as better to scream into the microphone. There's a catch. It's on a private exchange, and nobody's been able to cash it in. Are you saying it's not liquid? Asked the Swede. Liquid gold comes from distilleries in Islay. The hippie was nearly foaming at the mouth. I'm talking about not being able to cash in my coins for solid gold. Oh, you can still buy Schatzhorde Drachen coins, but the exchange no longer lets you cash out your assets. And everyone I know who's petitioned the exchange about selling their coins has disappeared. I see, said the Swede. And how many of these valuable and desirable digital coins do you hold? The hippie stared daggers at the Swede, which wasn't the most meaningful thing to be done during a podcast. How did you know? Tell the listeners how much you're in for. It's not that I'm in for that much. The hippie's voice dipped down a half octave closer to normal. I got in early for not much, but it's a lot of money now. And what were you planning on doing with all this gold you want to claim? Quit working for the man. The hippie's voice popped back up an octave. If I could cash it in, I'd have enough to buy a small farm and live off the land, grow potatoes and radishes. And mushrooms? We will not talk about mushrooms, growled the hippie. But that's not the point. The point is, somebody doesn't want anybody cashing out. It's a conspiracy. The man is holding the people down, and you know very well that the lizards are propping up the man. Something thumped against the outside window, and the conversation halted. The hippie and the Swede glanced at each other in nervous consternation, and as their eyes locked, another thump came from the window. Is this going to be a regular thing? the Swede said to no one in particular. The doorknob on the studio door turned, and the podcasting pair whipped their heads back towards that. Oh, hell. When Mr. Lewis opened the door, it wasn't the hippie and the Swede who caught his attention. There was a shape outside the window, a shape like a serpent, with wings and what looked like the outline of a rooster's head. Hit the deck! Mr. Lewis dove at the podcasters as the window exploded inward and glass shards flew everywhere. What was that? The hippie was under the table and attempting to peer out towards the broken window. Heads down! Mr. Lewis grabbed the hippie by the hair, pulling the head away from the direction of the window. Eyes on the floor. There's a cockatrice flying around in here. If you meet its gaze, you're dead. Now see here, growled the Swede. We do not discriminate against cocks on this program. Mr. Lewis bit his tongue, and the sound of flapping wings and hissing filled the conversation gap. That bird has a real gas problem, said the hippie. Yeah, about that, replied Mr. Lewis. A cockatrice's breath is sometimes poisonous, just like their stare. Do you two think you can manage crawling over to the door? We should get out of here. Just keep your heads down and don't meet its gaze. What if it's landed on my back? Asked the hippie. In fact, the cockatrice had landed on the hippie's back. It hissed, and its breath came out in a tiny and mildly corrosive cloud that settled on a shard of disco ball in front of its beak. The cockatrice pecked twice at the marred glass before noticing the shards to either side of it. The cockatrice glanced left and noticed itself. It glanced right and, always having thought its right side was the handsomer side, gave itself a longing glance. Cockatrice's field of vision slid up and down its reflection before longingly gazing into its own eyes. Then its eyes melted. Is it safe to move now? Asked the hippie as the cockatrice's body fell to the floor. Don't look at it! Mr. Lewis began to yell before realizing the thing on the ground didn't have a head left and its neck was receding as it continued to bubble and liquefy. Never mind, just don't touch the corpse. How did... Standing up and taking in the room, he realized what the hippie's fashion statement was. Where did you get a shirt like that? Asked Mr. Lewis. Is it custom made? There's a disco emporium up on Clayton, replied the hippie. They come in small, medium, large. I might look into getting one, said Mr. Lewis, leaning over the remains of the cockatrice. Could come in useful in my line of work. Wait a minute. The hippie gained a little composure upon getting a look at the cockatrice's corpse. Is that a chicken lizard? Is it an agent of the lizards? See? I told you the lizards were keeping us down. You can think of it that way if it helps, but it's not clear who or what sent it. Mr. Lewis frowned as he reached into his inner jacket pocket and produced a pen. With the tip of the pen, he pried a small piece of paper off the talon of the cockatrice's rooster-like foot. The paper seemed to be clean, so he flipped it over and discovered it was a photo of the hippie's face. Is this a publicity shot? Asked Mr. Lewis. Give me that. The Swede snatched the photo. No, I don't think I've seen this before. Why would somebody have... The hippie searched for the right words. That looks like a wallet-sized school photo of me. That's just weird. Indeed, said Mr. Lewis, noticing the developing lab's mark on the back of the photo. And that's no drugstore print. Somebody's spending money while they stalk you. Chapter 4. Chasing the Tail. Sure enough, someone had spent a reasonable amount of money on a fancy photo lab to make prints of the hippie's photo. It was an unusual size for a picture of an adult, so it was easily recalled by the manager. Perhaps someone thought an expensive lab would be discreet, but it wasn't a particularly large bill Mr. Lewis had to slip to the manager to get the purchaser's contact information. It helped that the prints had been charged to an accounts receivable department. Mr. Lewis was a little puzzled why someone would go to so much trail-leaving trouble instead of just using a laser printer, but he wasn't complaining. The company that did the buying was the Ophidia Trading Company, an import-export business that no one seemed to know much about, past that some basic business permits had been filed. The address was a warehouse, but at least a reasonably modern one. Standing across the street from the warehouse, Mr. Lewis peered at the building through a monocle, frowned, and then returned the monocle to his pocket. There was no outward appearance of magic to the building, but the assassination attempts had been conducted by creatures, not spells. It might not be a spellcaster he was looking for, and the absence of magic didn't necessarily mean anything to his search. Given the lack of information about the place and the lack of an aura around the building, Mr. Lewis decided the best way to proceed was to rattle the cage and hope nothing came out to bite him. The front door wasn't locked, and the reception area was empty. "Can I help you?" came a voice from the back. "I was in need of some assistance with an importation issue," Mr. Lewis called in the general direction of the voice. "And what kind of issue would that be?" A shadowy figure emerged from a doorway at the back of the room. "Sourcing exotic cuisine from my restaurant." Mr. Lewis moved further into the room. "How experienced are you with animals?" "Live animals?" The figure stuck to the shadows at the back of the room. "Unless you can get fresh bushmeat delivered quickly enough to serve." Mr. Lewis reached the center of the room. "And you are—" "I am the manager." "Right," continued Mr. Lewis. "So, I have a clientele with very peculiar tastes, and I'm looking to source a new tasting menu. Securing the animals is not really the issue. Transporting them into the country is." "Continue," said the manager from the shadows. "I'd like to start with a red bamboo snake for the appetizer. Probably cut it into nugget. I'll probably need 2 or 3 of those. That would be followed by a bisque made of inland taipan snake. I'd need at least 4 or 5. Then a fillet of Komodo dragon, maybe 2 of those." "Those are injurious animals," said the manager. "That would be a violation of the Lacey Act." "Well, you know, the laws of man. But you do import exotic reptiles on occasion, don't you?" "Who told you that?" hissed the manager, leaning forward a bit and revealing a face covered with scaly patches of skin. Almost like a dermatitis or psoriasis outbreak, thought Mr. Lewis, except instead of being red or silver, the scaly patches were more of a dull green. "Oh, one hears things. Animal lovers have their circles." "Animal eaters aren't quite the same thing as animal lovers. Your timing is good, though. I have just what you need in the back if you'll wait here." The manager stepped backwards through the doorway and was swallowed by the shadows. The sound of footsteps followed, and then the sound of a desk drawer slamming. After 2 minutes, the manager returned to the doorway, each newly gloved hand holding something. In the left hand, a rabbit, hanging by the ears. In the right hand, a knife. "It's very important you know how to feed a Komodo dragon." The manager spoke with the slightest hint of mirth. "Do you know what they eat?" "In the wild?" Mr. Lewis answered the question with a question. "Other animals, mostly." "That's right." The manager seemed to be suppressing a chuckle. "Meat. The dragon likes meat and adores the smell of blood." With that, the manager slashed the knife across the rabbit's belly and tossed it to Mr. Lewis, who caught it out of reflex. "Very good," continued the manager, dropping the knife to the floor and stripping off the gloves. "Now you're ready to make the friend you so humbly requested." The manager made an odd gesture as the right arm waved and a shuffling noise came from the shadows beyond the doorway. Mr. Lewis glanced down at his hands. The rabbit wasn't quite dead. It was bleeding all over him. A hiss came from the doorway. Mr. Lewis looked up and saw 6 inches of large, forked tongue flick through the darkness and into the light. Then it broke through. Running at him at what would have been a fast jog for a human was a lizard. A lizard that was around 9 feet long and looked to weigh in the neighborhood of 280 pounds. "Who in the hell keeps a Komodo dragon in a warehouse?" muttered Mr. Lewis. He threw the rabbit to the ground and started backing away. The rabbit tried to move but wasn't really up to it. That only lasted for a few seconds before the dragon ate it whole. Instead of belching and showing appreciation for a fine meal, the dragon turned its head to stare at Mr. Lewis. "What a lovely cologne you're wearing," cackled the manager, who snapped a finger. A clang caused Mr. Lewis to turn his head. An iron plate had fallen over the front door. A second clang and the window was covered too. Then when he turned his head back to face the front, the dragon was flicking that long tongue in his direction. "They almost love the smell as much as the taste," the manager sniggered while stepping backwards into the shadows of the doorway. Mr. Lewis took 2 steps backwards, turned, and ran. The dragon lunged forward and followed. It wasn't hard keeping ahead of the dragon. Komodo dragons were fast, as far as lizards go, but they couldn't run as fast as a human, particularly a human with terror and adrenaline flowing through their veins. The problem was being in an enclosed room with one. That and all those pointy teeth. The iron slab covering the door had dropped down from a railing above. It was too heavy to lift, and there wasn't time to look for whatever button or lever raised it with the dragon charging. He couldn't retreat, and on either side was a corner to be trapped in. Standing still was a worse idea, so he moved laterally to get a desk between himself and the giant lizard. It was a moderately heavy and moderately old oak desk with a moderately new roller chair behind it. He picked up the chair and hurled it at the dragon. It bounced off, but that was to be expected. Komodos had a thick hide that was effectively chainmail armor made out of bone. The dragon paused before the desk, and once more flicked its long yellow forked tongue into the air. Saliva, tinged red with the blood from the rabbit, dripped from its mouth, and the smell was not pleasant. Mr. Lewis winced at the odor and involuntarily took a half step back from the other side of the desk. The dragon lumbered forward 2 steps, set its claws on the desk, and snapped its jaw. It was as much of an opening as he was likely to get, so Mr. Lewis ducked down and launched himself into the desk's knee-hole and threw his arms up as he pushed through, knocking over the dragon as the desk flipped on top of it. Dropping on its back didn't really hurt the dragon, but it bought him time to start running towards the back of the warehouse as the Komodo shrugged off the desk and found its footing. As he reached the shadowy doorway the manager had disappeared into, the Komodo dragon was once more chasing him, swiftly shambling towards him in a motion resembling an alligator on angel dust. He slammed the door and glanced around. It was a fairly standard warehouse, crates, dust, and an open overhead door on a loading dock at the far end of the room where the manager presumably fled. The door shuddered. It seemed the dragon had caught up. Unfortunately, a hungry Komodo following the scent of blood wasn't likely to get bored and wander off any time soon. Mr. Lewis dragged a crate in front of the door. It wasn't much of a barricade, but it would have to do. The door shuddered again, this time with the slight sound of wood starting to splinter. "But those were precisely your orders!" The strangely exasperated voice of the manager screamed from somewhere beyond the warehouse. This was followed by a sound like wind blowing out a bonfire and a blast of heat that almost blistered Mr. Lewis's skin, even though he had no line of sight with the source. The door shuddered again, and the sound of cracking wood was more pronounced. Mr. Lewis slowly moved towards the loading dock. Behind him, the top half of the door caved in and toppled over the crate and onto the floor. Mr. Lewis reached the loading dock and carefully peeked out. Nothing stirred outside. Then the sound of more crunching drew his attention back into the warehouse. The dragon had crawled through the opening that used to be the top of the door, over the crate, blocking the still remaining lower half of the door, and was once more charging towards him. He stepped outside the warehouse, reached up to the overhead door, and slammed it down. He jumped down from the dock and took a closer look at his surroundings. To his left, almost at the corner of the building, was a scorch mark along the ground in a shape resembling a human body. That stretch of pavement was still warm enough to grill a steak. Along the wall were flecks of ash and burn marks in a pattern that resembled blood spatter. It seemed likely the manager wasn't going to be following orders any longer. The sound of lizard hitting metal came from the dock. The Komodo was still hungry. Chapter 5. Scope Creep. "But what happened to the Komodo dragon?" asked the head of HR. "I called animal control and let them worry about it," replied Mr. Lewis. "It was the damnedest thing. The animal wasn't magical. There also wasn't anywhere it could have been kept in that warehouse. I think it might have been teleported in from Komodo. It's probably a good thing I didn't inquire about a silverback gorilla. I don't think I could have outrun one of those." Mr. Lewis had returned to his client's office to report, but his findings were far from conclusive. "So you think this person," the head of HR paused to search for the right words, "conjured up those creatures that wrecked the studio and tried to kill the hippie and the Swede?" "There's circumstantial evidence. I just can't really tell you why. There wasn't a lot of meaningful paperwork in that building to tie management to anything. Based on the shouting I overheard, my best guess is that it was either a contract hit or someone was following orders from higher up the food chain." "But this manager is dead?" asked the head of HR. "Vaporized," replied Mr. Lewis. "The only thing left were ashes and scorch mark. Someone, scratch that, something unleash the equivalent of a blast furnace on that manager. Guessing that thing was either a client or some kind of upper management, and it's highly unlikely that blast furnace was something that occurs in nature. So, this isn't over. Doubtful. And I'm not sure how much danger the Swede is in, but the hippie absolutely needs to stay out of sight for the time being. How long is this going to take to clear up? Asked the head of HR. Would be helpful to give me a better idea of how much to budget for this. I really don't know, replied Mr. Lewis. Whatever kind of operation that company was fronting, it was a very clean setup. It's going to take some digging just to know where to ask the next questions. And if that doesn't work, we might need to use your employees as bait to draw out whoever's responsible. I smell red ink pooling for that podcast, sighed the head of HR. Still, they're employees. We can't set a precedent of hanging them out to dry. What exactly is their podcast about, anyway? I don't know. The head of HR shrugged. Nobody here's been able to figure it out. They just have enough of an audience for us to absorb their show. It's looking like a poor use of resources at the moment. I might be able to give you a lead, though I'm not sure how credible it is. The head of HR slid an inch-thick manila folder across the table. The hippie has theories about a lot of things, continued the head of HR. It's not clear if they're based in reality, but it's good enough for a small audience. A lot of the broadcasts have centered around a wealthy individual. This individual have a name? We don't say it out loud. It's also in the hippie's contract not to say it out loud on the podcast. We refer to this individual as the billionaire. The billionaire is litigious, and while lawsuits can be good for publicity, we don't need the added expense, especially when the accusations are not sufficiently substantiated by documentation. I recognize the name. Mr. Lewis flipped through the folder. It is thought that the billionaire owns that export warehouse you visited. Not known, but thought. There are a lot of holding companies associated with the billionaire, and it's hard to prove anything. Oh, really? Said Mr. Lewis. So let me get this straight. The hippie's been trying to air this billionaire's dirty laundry on the podcast? As blind items, but yes. And the hippie thinks this billionaire is a lizard? Mr. Lewis stopped to reread the page in the folder. Read on. And this billionaire is thought to run the cryptocurrency exchange in question. That's not been confirmed. And this individual has a habit of shorting company stocks just before they implode, and then turning around and buying the stock at the bottom of the trough before a recovery. That we have been able to partially confirm, at least that the shorts happened, and the stocks were purchased near the bottom of the trough. However, it was holding companies executing the transactions. We have not been able to confirm the owners of the holding companies involved. Was the billionaire involved? Possible, maybe even likely, but unclear from a strictly legal perspective. You spend a lot of time confirming conspiracy theories in your line of work? When they're on one of our podcasts, legal likes to double-check things. Mr. Lewis sighed, frowned, and turned to the next page. And it is thought that your billionaire is currently shorting a pharma stock? There is a holding company currently shorting the stock. The head of HR nodded in affirmation. And, as it is written in the folder, the CEO of the company has been having a public meltdown. That's not really an unusual thing for a CEO to be doing in the current market, replied Mr. Lewis. The stock being shorted preceded the CEO's erratic behavior by a few days. Did the short presage the behavior? That isn't nearly as clear. That's the hedge fund pattern, though, isn't it? Short the stock, drop a damning report to the financial press, and reap the rewards as the stock's price plummets. Except no report was issued, just the short. Your billionaire has some insider information on the CEO blowing a gasket? Perhaps. But it seems unlikely someone could come across that kind of information before anyone else 6 times in the last year. And if they did, you'd think that would be impossible to keep quiet, so everyone would know about it. Hold on. Mr. Lewis arched an eyebrow. Are you saying this is the 6th time this has happened? In each of the other 5 incidents we could confirm, the head of HR continued, The CEO of the targeted stock had a similarly volatile incident that damaged the public perception of the company and its stock. Each time, the stock has been shorted a few days before the chaos struck. Is it the billionaire orchestrating things behind the scenes? The hippie thinks so, but as an institution, we could never have an opinion on that. At least not without documented proof. No, repeating rumors can lead to all kinds of trouble with a litigious subject. I suppose the question is ultimately whether this is coincidence, happenstance, or enemy action. You would think there would be limits on how much coincidence one person could experience. The head of HR nodded. Some experience higher levels of coincidence than others. But let's say I uncover some enemy action. Some of these theories point towards criminal conspiracies. If that turns out to be true, do you actually want that fully investigated and documented? We could never officially have an opinion on anything like that or authorize something like that. We just need to make sure our employees are safe. I understand completely. Mr. Lewis stood up. Let me give these theories a field test, and I'll get back to you.